Good evening. I hope all of you are enjoying your lovely little snowy evening. While I am sitting in the comfort of my home with my dogs, here I am creating a video for you to walk you through some of the things I normally would have done tonight anyway. So the first one is what you see right in front of you, the Publication Manual of the American Psychological Association, otherwise known as the APA Style Manual. So I'm going to talk to you about the APA Style Manual, which you are required to have for this course. And the reason why, and we'll kind of get into this as we walk through this, is there's just so many things that you realistically cannot memorize that you really do need to have the publication manual with you. Now, this is the 6th edition of the American Psychological Association Style Manual. It's the blue one, so if you by chance get a red and black one, that is not accurate. It is a blue cover. Now, one thing you do want to make sure, I'm going to scroll through here and show you this. It was published originally, as you see here, in 2010. Now, what I want you to check is this number right here. Notice we have the 2nd printing, 3rd printing, 4th printing. What I don't want yours to say is 1st printing and nothing else. There were a number of problems with the 1st printing, so if that's the one that you have, it's actually going to have some out-of-date information, which is going to make your life a lot more miserable because I'd have to give you a supplemental packet of information on everything that had to get fixed. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the basic chapters. So the first chapter right here is just the introduction. It kind of tells you a little bit about the history of the American Psychological Association. For example, that the APA Style Manual, not in its form it is today, but it's been around since 1929. So it is the oldest of the style manuals that is actually out there. Then we can get into the next chapter, chapter 1, which is all about writing for the behavioral and social sciences. Chapter 2 is all about manuscript structure and content. This is a very important chapter, and we'll look at that one. Chapter 3 is all about writing clearly and concisely. This is basically where it actually talks a lot about how to write about research. So it really is an important chapter to look at, to think about how do we actually write about this stuff and how it's distinctly different than other types of writing. Chapter 4 is the mechanics of style. One of the things that style manuals always do is actually talk about things like grammar and spelling and italics and punctuation and when to use underlines versus bold. So this chapter is very important because the APA style manual has a lot of big specifics on how we are supposed to do things. And so when it comes down to it, we always go back to this chapter when it comes to style issues with your writing with APA. Chapter 5 is all about displaying results. And this is basically, hey, you have research results. How do we actually show those? Chapter 16 gets into more along the lines of what most people think of when they think of the style manual, which is how do we credit sources? How do we cite things using in-text citations? Chapter 7 is all about references. So this is another one. Chapter 6 and chapter 7 kind of go hand in hand. And then, of course, chapter 8 talks more about, well, what is it like to actually publish something? And then you have your appendix, which basically, as you can see here, it's the journal article reporting standards on things like meta-analysis and other things, which we're probably not going to be worrying about in this class, but just to show you that it's there. And then, of course, like anything that's good, it has its own references. And, of course, there's also the index. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually walk you through a couple of the parts that I really want you to pay attention to. The first one is what's called the manuscript elements. You can find this right here on page 23. It is section 2.01. This is really where we get into the layout of what the expectations are for a APA styled paper. So the first section is all about writing a title, which again, you've written titles before, but it does have some specifics that people don't always know. For example, like right here, it says the recommended length for a title is no more than 12 words. So again, there are these things that APA has in it. It's not to say that that's a hard truth because I've seen some longer titles, but that is what their recommendation is. Then it talks about the author's name and byline and institutional affiliation. One difference between APA style and some of the other styles out there is that there is the expectation that you show us always who the authors are. I'm actually going to go ahead and increase this real fast just so you can see it a little bit easier on your screen. So again, there's also the byline. We also have the institutional affiliation, which is basically, for our purposes, SUNY New Paltz. And you can see here, like one author, no affiliation, Mary Haggerty, Rochester, New York. But again, the most common one obviously is going to be something like this one right here. David Wolf, University of California, Berkeley, and Amanda Blue, Brandon University. And again, you've probably seen something like that before. There is also this thing called an author note, and we'll talk more about author notes when we actually start formatting your paper. So for now, just know that that's there, and I'm going to keep going. The next section is the abstract. Abstracts, again, the whole purpose of an abstract is to quickly summarize what's going on. And there are some specific things that the APA says that an abstract should be. It should be accurate, non-evaluative, coherent and readable, and concise. Those are the 4 key pillars of a good abstract. As it says here, accurate, you ensure that the abstract correctly reflects the purpose and content of the manuscript. As such, you cannot write an abstract and have it accurate until your entire rest of your paper is written. Hence why the abstract is the absolute last thing you ever write. It is non-evaluative. As it says here, you report rather than evaluate. Do not add to or comment on what is in the body of the manuscript. It should be coherent and readable. It should be written in clear and concise language. Use verbs rather than their noun equivalents and active rather than passive voice. And lastly, it should be concise. Again, this is not a retelling of everything in there. At times you have to shorten it. That's perfectly normal. But again, the goal here is to make it as simple and to the point as humanly possible. So there's some other things that it talks about in there. I just wanted to hit this right here. Your typical abstract is going to be between 150 to 250 words. From there, we get into the introduction. And one of the things with the introduction, and just as an FYI, you never label the introduction of a paper in APA style. It's just assumed that if it's the first paragraph in your paper, it's the introduction. So we don't have to do that. But here are some questions that they always say that it's good for you to think about. What is the problem? Why is the problem important? How does the study relate to previous work in the area? If other aspects of this study have been reportedly previously, how does this report differ from or build upon those earlier ones? What are the primary and secondary hypotheses and objectives of the study? And what, if any, are the links to theory? How do the hypotheses and research design relate to one another? And what are the theoretical and practical implications of this study? And then it talks about some basic things. Obviously, in your introduction, you want to explore the importance of the problem, describe how it's relevant to current scholarship, again, state your hypotheses and correspondence to research design. Then we get into the actual literature review, which we'll discuss more. Then you have what's called the methods section. The methods section is basically where you go about telling the people that are reading what it is that you've actually done or what you're doing in your study. And again, we'll look more at that later. But some of the more common parts of it are this section right here, are participant characteristics. Some of the ones that are the most common, obviously, are these demographic ones. Let me highlight these and then I'll read the list that they have here for us. Demographic characteristics such as age, sex, ethnic and or racial group, level of education, socioeconomic, generational or immigrant status, disability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and language preference, as well as important topic-specific characteristics like achievement level in studies of educational interventions. So again, the whole purpose of the participant section in the methods is to basically tell us who these people are. And so obviously the demographics is one of the most important ways to do that. And here is an example of what one of these would look like. It says here, the second group included 40 women between the ages of 20 and 30 years. Now, if you ever see this little M right here and it's italicized, that means the mean age or the average. So in this case, the mean age for the group was 24.2. And SD here in italicized stands for standard deviation. And for our purposes here, the standard deviation was 2.1. All of whom had immigrated from El Salvador, had at least 12 years of education, and been permanent residents of the United States for at least 10 years, and lived in Washington, D.C. So you can tell how this kind of gives you some really big specifics about who the people are that they included in this study. Then we talk about if there's sampling procedures, then it gets into some other things like sampling size, power, and precision, which most of you won't have to worry about, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. Then if you go in there, you may have a measures section, or what we call the instrumentation section, where if you have research measures, whether they're written questions, interviews, or observations, you want to tell us what it is that you're collecting and how you went about doing that. You also want to talk about your research design. If you're doing a simple survey, you would be like, okay, here is the survey that we created, and then maybe we used Qualtrics, and then we put it on Facebook and Twitter and other social networking sites, encouraging people to participate. Or maybe you went to businesses and handed them out, and you did it all face-to-face. You have to tell people how you actually went about doing that. If you're running an experiment, you talk about any experimental manipulations or interventions. We can talk more about that later. Right now, I'm just kind of showing you the highlights. The next section is what's called the results section. And the results section is where you tell us what you found. Whether you're doing a qualitative study or you're doing a quantitative study, here are the results that we actually have. And in this section, it's not as much about interpretation as it is being, here is what it is that we found. And you can kind of go through and read that section to get a little bit more information. The last section in an APA paper is what is called the discussion section. And this is where you make heads or tails of what it is that you found in that results section. So for our purposes, you'd be like, here is, I found this in my study, and here's what this means. Maybe it relates back to that specific theory. Other things that we do during this is we also have, in any research, you're always going to have what we call limitations, which are things that could possibly have gone wrong. Maybe you had, 90% females in your study. Well, that's obviously going to be a limitation if your goal was to be able to compare males and females in a study. So that's an example of those things that we have to think about. And lastly, you have in the discussion is what's called future directions for research. And this is where you go, you know what, after we've conducted this study and after we've thought about this for a while, here are some things that we think we should probably do in the future. The next major section I want you to pay attention to in the APA Style Manual is this one right here. It is on page 41. On page 41, you see a sample paper. Now, these are really important because it kind of shows you how things are laid out in APA style. So let's walk through this. First thing you're going to see up here, this will be 1/2 inch down. And as you can see here, it's basically right at 1 inch on the left-hand margin. You have the word running head, followed by a colon. And then you have the running head itself. A running head is a shortened version of the title. And you'll see that is in all capital letters. And of course, over here to the right of that is the page number. Now, this is for the cover page. Then you have, as you see here, the next thing you have is the title of the manuscript. And then you have the authors. This would be where all of the authors go. And of course, as we talked about earlier, that institutional affiliation. And one of the nice things about this, and you'll see these little breakouts like here, I'll highlight this one. You'll see that it says establishing a title. It says 2.01. That means you can go back to chapter 2, section 01, and it talks about how do we write titles. Or preparing the manuscript for submission. That's going to be in chapter 8, section 3. So that's what these little call out things over here are for, is to show you where in the APA Style Manual these rules are coming from. And then it talks about the author note, and you can see the elements right there. Then you get to the second page, and now you have the word abstract. Now you'll notice the word abstract is centered. It is not bolded. Now again, until you finish your study way at the end of the semester, you do not need to write an abstract. Now, what I always do is I always put the abstract page in there and just leave it blank. And then once I get to that point, I can come back and write that. But you do not write an abstract until you've actually finished your study. Now, other things to notice here, to learn more about writing an abstract, again, that's section 2.04. We already looked at that. Notice, though, that we no longer have that word running head after the first page. This is just now officially the running head. It's still 1/2 inch down, 1 inch over, and again, it automatically goes to the second page. There's the APA style tutorial that actually will show you how to do this in Microsoft Word so that you have one header on one page, and then the second page and thereafter has a different header. There is a way to do that. That's one of the nice things about using Microsoft Word. So again, going down, you'll notice right here that it is left justified. That means that there is no tabbing when it comes to the abstract. You just write it out. Then you have the abstract itself. Then we have what's called a list of keywords. You'll notice that the keywords is all through as a colon. That is italicized. And then you have in lowercase a list of, these are primary keywords that relate to your study. And again, we'll be developing those as we go along. So this is, again, that's the cover page and the abstract page. Then we get to the actual first page of the actual paper. Notice right here, centered at the top, is the title of the paper again. And again, you can learn about writing an introduction in section 2.05. Notice at this point, though, it has started to be tabbed. From the bulk of the text in APA style, every paragraph has that 1 inch or ½ inch tab. And it's important to notice that, again, everything is double spaced. Even on the cover page and even on the abstract, everything is double spaced. So, again, notice that there is no heading here that says introduction. Again, if the first paragraph is just considered to be the introduction. And then it talks about some things relating to ordering of citations and some other things here that are broken out for you to look at. Again, these are all some of those rules that you would find in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and in stopping with 16, because 17 or chapter 7. I keep talking. Okay, let me say this again. In chapters 3, writing clearly and concisely. Chapter 4, the mechanics of style. Chapter 5, displaying results. And chapter 6, crediting your sources. Those are the chapters that these are all you're going to notice are pulling out from. Okay, I'm keeping scrolling. You can see, as you saw right there, I'm doing this live. So yeah, there may be a few problems, and I'm sorry about that. You can then get here down here. This is now officially the method section. Again, you'll notice the word method here is centered and bolded. That is what is called a level 1 heading. Participants over here is left justified and bolded. That is what is called a level 2 heading. So you'll notice that method is centered, bolded all by itself. Participants is left justified, bolded all by itself. Then it talks about who the participants were. Then it has materials and procedures. Then we get down here to this. This is what is called a level 3 heading. And I just wanted to point this out so that you would see what a level 3 heading is, because we're going to look at those specifically in just a second. So a level 3 heading, you'll notice, is tabbed over. It is still bolded, but now we have both an uppercase and lowercase letters, which we did not have on the level 2. And it starts in line with the actual paragraph. So you'll see all that kind of rolls right from one to the next. And so that's a level 3 heading. Before we get out of here, again, here is the results page. And again, results is at level 1. It's centered and bolded. And I want to get here down to the reference page. So I'm going to scroll, just so we can see one. There we go. And then we get to the references. Now, this is a reference page. So a couple things I just want to highlight. We'll talk more in a different video about doing the references. But one thing I want you to notice is that the word references is centered. It is not bolded. It is not considered a level 1 heading. We also have in APA style what is called this hanging indent. And that is a nice way of saying that the first part of your reference is always going to be left justified. Everything else is that tabbed over by 1/2 inch. And in the other video on doing APA style, there is a part of that that's actually going to show you, again, how to format that automatically in Microsoft Word. So what you don't want to do is like have a hard return and then actually physically hit tab here, because that's actually going to cause more problems. And that's definitely not something that we want to see. So that's kind of how those are formatted. So here are the heading levels. We're on page 62, and I'm going to jump back to that larger size here so we can look at it. So these are those major headings that we have. Most do not go beyond level 3, but we do have up to level 5 levels of headings. So we have a level 1, it's that centered, boldface, uppercase, and lowercase heading. We have this level 2, which is flushed left, boldface, uppercase, and lowercase heading. That's just a nice way of saying we have uppercase. So notice none of these are just all in uppercase when it comes to these headings. Then we have this one right here, which is that level 3 one, and that is indented, boldface, lowercase, paragraph heading ending with a period. And so that's basically this. We looked at that. That's exactly what it looks like. You'll see here, it's indented, it is boldface, lowercase, and again, it ends with a period. And so the next one is in the same thing, but it's now indented, boldface, italicized, lowercase, paragraph heading ending with a period. And the last type that we have is just not bolded. So again, these are the levels that you have available to you. But again, most APA style papers do not go beyond those first 3. So let's talk about crediting sources. So as we already mentioned, Chapter 6 is all about how we actually go about doing this. Now, when you look at Chapter 6, there's always these questions. And again, I'm not going to read this to you, so I do want you to look at this. Like, when do you need to cite information? And it talks about how to do it. It talks about plagiarism. It talks about quoting material versus paraphrasing. Again, really look at this section. This is very important because it kind of shows you some things. So really, you do need to look at this part to kind of get an idea. What I want to show you is this chart right here. And again, I'm going to get that back up to that larger font. This is a table, and I want you to go ahead and mark this. This is page 177 in your APA style manual. This is really important because it tells you how to do what we call in-text citations. So anytime that you have a source that you use, you're going to use an in-text citation. Now, the most common one is this one right here. It's a one work by one author. This is like someone wrote a book. And so this is it. You'll have their last name. Notice in APA style, for the most part, we only use last names. We do not use initials, and we do not use their first names in the text. It's always their last name with the year of the publication. So in this case, for the first two, the first citation is just going to be Walker, and it has in that parentheses 2007. One thing that I also want to highlight right here is the last name of the author and the year always go together. So I should never see something where you say Walker, and then at the end of the sentence, like, 25 characters later, it has the date. No, the date and the name always are together. In any subsequent citation, it's just Walker and then 2007. The second type we have is what is called a parenthetical citation. And that's what you have when you have this one that happens in parentheses. These are most commonly seen at the end of a sentence. Or if you have one in the middle of a sentence, it's where it's right before a major piece of punctuation. And in that other tutorial on APA style that you're going to go through, it's going to show you some examples of that. So you can kind of go through. So we're going to look at one that's a little bit more confusing, like this one right here. One work by 6 or more authors, because we have those. If it's the very first time, we automatically, instead of listing all those authors out, because that just gets lengthy, we literally just start with the first author, and we immediately go to this thing called et al, or and others. And that's just a way of abbreviating this in the text. And so if you have more than 6 authors on something, we always just use that et al. Now, go back and let's look at this one that here that only has 3 authors. The very first time you do it, you'll write out all the names. So for the most part, most of the time, for most sources, unless it has 6 or more authors, we always list out all of the authors the first time we cite it. After that, then we actually start using that et al. So the very first time, this one is Bradley, Ramirez, and Sue in 1999. Any other subsequent citations in the paper is just going to be Bradley et al. You'll notice that it's that first person's name, there's a space, lowercase et, notice there is no period there, but there is a space, then there is al, and that's where that period is, and then you have the open parentheses with the date. So that is that et al. If we're doing it the very first time in a parenthetical, it's the same thing. It's Bradley, comma, Ramirez, comma. Notice now, though, that we use an ampersand. So notice, if it's writing it within a sentence, we spell it out. If it's within parentheses, we use an ampersand. So this one's Bradley, Ramirez, and Sue, ampersand there, the date, and then any subsequent citation is this right here. It's Bradley et al. And the year. So again, we'll get a little bit better as we do this going forward, but I want you to notice that this is a really important thing to start picking up on. The next major part of the APA Style Manual that I really want you to spend some time in is Chapter 7, References. Now, one of the things that we know when it comes to references is there are software out there, even in Microsoft Word, it claims to do it. If you go into the library database website, it claims to be able to do it. It's been my experience over many years that most of the time, these are wrong. And we're actually going to show you how some of these are wrong in a separate video, but just know that this is a problem. It's a very common problem. So that's why you have to be smarter and use the APA Style Manual and not rely on those software to do it for you. It can help. It definitely can help. But you always have to be smarter than the software, which is why you always have to double check to make sure that your sources conform to APA style. So let's look at how this section is laid out. The first thing you're going to have here are what we call types and variations. So it has a sections, and it has periodicals. These are like journal articles. That's the most common type. But it has a wide variety. And you're going to see that these have numbers next to them. So number 2, number 14. We'll look at what those mean in just a section. This actually is going to correspond with all of the samples that we're going to look at in just a second. So the one that's probably going to be one of the ones that's the most common for you, again, making this a little bit larger, are going to be these ones right here. Journal article with a digital object identifier and without a digital object identifier. Those are the most common ones that we'll be using for any of the research that you write in this class. So those are the ones that are probably the ones you'll use the most. Then we have the next section, which is all books, reference books, and book chapters. If it's an entire book, that means it's written by one author or a set of authors. That's a book. For our purposes, a lot of the times it's actually more chapters in edited books. A lot of academic books, for example, the one that you guys have that is the personal relationships book. Each chapter is written by a different author or author group. So each of those chapters has to be cited as a chapter in an edited book. On the opposite hand, you have the Sias textbook. That's written just by Patricia Sias. It's just her. So that's just a traditional book. And so that's why you got to know what kind of references that you're dealing with so that you do use the most appropriate version for your citation. And we'll look at those in a second. If by chance you come across technical and research report, media and symposia, these are like conferences and conventions. It's also possible you'll run across a doctoral dissertation or a master's thesis. So there's a number of different things. I'm scrolling. Again, these are just some of the ways that they know that people may end up having to cite things. After that, you then have author variations. And so it may be that you have an association that authored something, or as I keep going, it's editors, or, you may have a government agency, and so on and so on. So those are just author variations. Then we get title variations. For example, if it's a work that's not English, how do we cite that? If there's volume numbers, how do we handle those? Then there's the publication information. For example, the author as the publisher, or it's an electronic version of a print book. And so you have to handle an electronic or an ebook version differently than you would a regular book. So here is the examples by type. This is the most basic, as you see here. It's the general reference. It is author. And so you'll see we have author A, B, and C. So you have author, comma, then there's a space there. Then you have the first initial, and this it's A. You'll notice there's a space, and then there's another A, period. You'll follow by a comma, followed by a space. And then we're going to repeat the same thing for author B. So it's author, comma, space, capital letter B for the first initial, period, space, capital letter B for the second initial, period, followed by another comma. Notice then that there's another space. Then we have our ampersand. So in the references, we never spell out the word and when we're listing the authors. It's always the ampersand, followed by a space, and then you get the information for author number 3. After that, you're going to have another space. Then you have an open parentheses. You put the year of the publication, close parentheses, and a period. And then again, there's going to be a space right there. Then you have the title of the article. Now, here's what I want you to notice. In the title of the article, the first word is capitalized. All of the subsequent letters in that are not. The only time this doesn't do this is for 2 reasons. One, if you have a piece of major punctuation in the title, for example, there's a colon. Well, then the first letter following that colon is also capitalized. Or, this is number 2, why a letter or word would not be capital or would be capitalized, is if it's a proper noun. Then you have the title of the periodical, so this would be the journal title. And what I want you to notice here is that it's title of periodical. Notice that it is capitalized. This is what we call title case, and it is, the word of is not, but it is italicized. The comma following the title is italicized. Then we have this little XX here, and this stands for the volume number of the periodical. And those are italicized, the volume number. But notice right here that that little comma after the title of the periodical and the volume number is not italicized. And then there's a space, and then you have the page numbers. Here you would actually have numbers, not the actual PP dash to PP. followed by the period. And then last but not least, if there is what's called as you see right here, a digital object identifier, or a DOI, then that is the last thing that goes there on that line. So this is your basic general reference that you'll always see in APA style. So that's pretty much how it starts right off the bat. So let's look at this. So remember those numbers we talked about? I'm going to scroll up just real fast. These numbers, like, so pages, discontinuous, or we'll start with this one because it's one of the first ones. It says pagination is by issue rather than by volume. Number 3. So you can kind of come through here and you'll scroll down and you'll go, and here is number 3. And so we can go that one of these is done by issue. Now, what that means, this is actually a really good thing to know. In APA style, there is what's called a volume number, and volume numbers generally run from one year to the next. And then there's what's called the issue number. For example, some journals come out 4 times a year, others come out 6 times a year. So it could be that it's volume, let's say like we have here, that it's volume 2, issue 2. If the issue for each and every issue starts back at page 1, then you need to include the issue number. However, the overwhelming majority of journals have what we call continuous pagination. And what that means is if the end of issue 1 stops on page 50, then when we get issue 2, it starts on page 51. It doesn't go back to page 1. If it has continuous pagination, you do not need to include the issue number. You only do that when you have that issue, as we saw right up here. When I scroll back up so we can look at that one, it's pagination by issue rather than volume. And again, that volume is one that it's continuous pagination. So in this case, it's by issue. Hence why when we scroll down here to number 3, on both of these examples, it has the issue number there. For the overwhelming majority of time, we do not include that. And this is one of those things where a lot of time, those software programs that help you spit this out, even though it is not necessary. Again, you can kind of scroll through here. I'm going to just highlight a couple of the other ones as I'm going to try not to make you completely dizzy while I'm scrolling through to come to a couple that I do want to make sure that we hit on. So I do want to go to this next one, which is right here, which is books, reference books, and book chapters. Here is the most common version. It literally is author. Then we have the year, the title of the work, and again, notice that only the first letter is capitalized and italicized. All the other letters are lowercase. The same thing actually holds true, though. If there's a proper noun or if there's another piece of punctuation, the first letter is capitalized after the piece of punctuation, or proper noun is. Then we have the location. And now in APA style, the location, if it's in the United States, is both city and state. If it is an international publication, it is country and city. And then we have the publisher. And then there's a couple variations on that you can look at right there. But the second one is the one that I want you to pay attention to, which this one right here is what's called a chapter in an edited book. So in this case, we have 2 authors. So we have author A. Notice when there's 2, you still have that comma following the first author in the ampersand. And then we have author B, the year. Notice that the title of the chapter is not italicized. It is that sentence case. So the capital letter, and then it goes out from there. Then we get what's called the editor information. For example, if you look at your personal relationship book, you'll notice that you have the 2 editors of that book. And so it's important to cite those editors. And so this is what this is referring to. So you have editor A, B, and C. Then you're going to have this open parentheses, capital EDS period, close parentheses, comma. So that just lets us know that's in their book and they're the editors. Then you have the title of the book. You notice that the title of the book is sentence case, but it is italicized. Then you have an open parentheses, and then you will literally put in there PP period, and then you're going to have the page range for that chapter. Then it's close parentheses and period, and then again you have the location and the publisher. And again, there's a couple other variations here, but this is the most common one. So really, the 2 that are the most common is going to be the basic article and the chapter in an edited book. While you may have other references, those are the 2 that realistically you're going to see the most often. Okay, so that kind of walks us through the examples. And again, you're going to go through here and say, hey, here is an entire book. It's a print version. It's an example. Here's an ebook only. What does that look like? So again, there's plenty of examples in here. So again, when you go back to that, you always want to look at that. And again, that starts on page 193. So make sure that you mark that. So the sections I said that you should probably mark: manuscript elements starts on page 23. The sample paper starts on page 41. The heading levels start on page 62. The information on how to credit sources, or chapter 6, starts on page 169. That chart that has the basic citation styles, come on, there we go, starts on page 177. And last but not least, the references start right there for you on page 193. So that is an overview of the APA Style Manual. I'm going to have a different video that's going to talk more about the library and referencing.